Hi, Jill.
All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our Athletics Canada webinar, Laying the Foundation, Protecting Health and Performance in Developing Athletes. My name is Jill Mallon, and I'm a middle distance coach with the University of Toronto Track Club. Tonight, I'm really excited to introduce Nikita Komarov, who is a sports physiotherapist and also our head therapist for the University of Toronto Varsity Track and Field program. He has treated many of our club and varsity athletes, sprinters, jumpers, middle distance runners of various ages, club athletes from ages 12 to our senior and master athletes. Nick has a wealth of experience and has been a valuable resource for all of our coaches and athletes here at U of T. Tonight, Nick is going to talk about our younger athletes, understanding their development, ways to measure and monitor their training in the context of long-term athlete development. We're also joined by Kyle Smith, our athletics director, or Athletics Canada Coaching Education Coordinator, who's supporting us behind the scenes as a question moderator. So just a couple of things before Nikita begins his presentation. You're all muted. If you have questions, please add them to the question dialog box on your screen. After Nikita's presentation, we'll leave about 20 minutes to answer questions at the end. We'll do our best to get to all of them. We're recording this webinar, as you've seen, and it'll be posted in the upcoming days on the AC YouTube channel. Finally, coaches who have entered their NCCP number and are NCC certified will receive 1 professional development point for their participation in the webinar. So thank you for joining us tonight. And with that, let's get started. Nikita, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Jill, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. As Jill mentioned, I'm Nikita. I'm the head therapist here at U of T with the track and field program. We have a beautiful evening here at Varsity Stadium with the football team wrapping up their practice, so hopefully they won't be too rowdy. So I wanted to introduce today's topic by kind of conveying to you a conference that I watched, and a lot of these are now available online. You're welcome to look up and find them yourselves. This one took place at the International Conference on Medicine and Science and Athletics in Doha, Qatar, by, as you can see on the screen there, Dr. Marco Cardinal. I'm just going to take a brief opportunity just to introduce him. So currently, he's the executive director of research and scientific support at Aspetar in Qatar. If you're not familiar, I would highly recommend you look up this organization. It's really one of the top end facilities around the world. Prior to that, as you can see there, he was the head of sports physiology at Aspire Academy, as well as the head of sports science and research of the British Olympic Association. So we're going to just take a few moments. I will try to be as succinct as possible and do my best to convey Marco's message. He really shaped my understanding on this subject matter, and so hopefully I can kind of pass it on to the viewers here. So young athletes, and I think his biggest message are not many adults, and I think that's something that I've really integrated that thinking into my practice as a physiotherapist. So youth athlete development is contingent on individually unique and constantly changing base of normal growth and biological maturation and behavioral development. Knowledge of the development is key to provide appropriate coaching strategies. And I think the biggest message as we'll go through this presentation, that success at an early stage does not guarantee success at the senior level. And as Marco and I really, that kind of graphic stayed with me. So the bottle, the line from the bottle to the medal is not linear, and it's difficult to predict. So what we can do as medical staff and coaching staff is just have the best tools at hand to help them to set them on their journey. This next slide here talks a little about the journey. I think we're all probably familiar, regardless of the sport, on the long-term athlete development framework. So this, I think, represents really any sport you can apply it to. And Generally, if we look at it here, we have 6 to 11, where we're just introducing them to movement, engaging in different activities and sports, appreciating sport, and we're just really just fundamentals. As we move forward, and this is probably will be one of the big talking points today, is this learning to train early adolescent 12 to 14 age group, and we'll talk about why in a moment. And that kind of sets the stage to the rest of the journey here, as you can see, into adolescence, which is here defined as 15 to 18, where we're training to train and beginning to training to compete. And further up along here, junior, which is sort of the environment that I work at a university, is where they're starting to train to compete, and eventually at the senior level, training to win. So how do we navigate this early adolescence phase? Again, I think is the main topic of today's talk. So some key aspects to consider, and this is where it gets a little sciencey, and we'll have questions, time for questions after, but the gold standard that we consider is maturity status. So status of the young athlete at the time of the observation, which is known as skeletal age. So the way that skeletal age is established is via X-ray. And I will say that I've looked around, and this is not done too much as a kind of a prevention screening tool in Canada, but basically involves screening or X-raying the left wrist, and they can match and assess at what level of skeletal maturity individual is at. We do it for injury, and it kind of depends by sport, but I think just having that awareness and knowledge of this variable, just as we go through the presentation, is important. The second one is age at peak height velocity. Also, if we're talking about women, it's age of menarche, and I'll have a graph at the end to demonstrate that relationship. So the age of peak height velocity is basically the rate of growth, and we measure when is that particular individual athlete is going through their most rapid period of growth in terms of height. As you can probably decipher here, and probably know this, females, they go through this a little bit earlier than boys do. Again, we'll go through some of the specifics in the data as we go through the presentation here. Here, Marco is demonstrating, this is a cohort of athletes coming into the Aspetar Academy. These are boys, and I have some notes on this particular. So the group of boys here, this is 1 year. They're all, the youngest is 11.8. and the oldest is 12.6. So that's a 1 year history difference in their chronological age. However, when they apply the skeletal X-ray, and again, looking at those bony ossification and closure of the growth plates, there was a 6.5 year difference among this group. And that's kind of what that chart depicts. At the top is their chronological age, and at the bottom is their skeletal age. So you can see there's someone that's actually below 11 in skeletal age, and there's one that is 17 and a half. And this is a group of 12-year-olds. In the graph just above there, it kind of depicts the stages, which will also elaborate more. So we have the pre-peak height velocity. So they're growing, but they have not reached their maximal rate of growth. And then we have peak height velocity, or circa peak height velocity, as they're going through that period. And then we have our post-peak height velocity once they've surpassed. And you can see on the chart, again, female girls, they go through that process a little bit earlier, usually from anywhere from, in Northern Hemisphere, 12 to 13 years of age, and boys tend to more be at 14, 15 years of age. So just determining, and again, and we'll talk about some of the high-tech and low-tech ways, and depending on your individual environment, how you can get some of this information and how you can use it. So here, this is more from data that that's been accumulated over the years. Let me see. So here, physical abilities improve with age. So this graph is just high school students. They're not athletes, and really what it depicts is that their physical capabilities, characteristics improve with age. Here, some of the things are listed as standing broad jump, hanging strength, muscle, just cross-section of muscle mass across their body, across the age. The graph on the right there holds that shuttle runs. And that was done from all over the world, and this is in school, like in high school students who are not athletes. And what it shows is that kids, if you just keep them moving, they will continue to improve over time. Okay, so this is the bottom graph. There is girls. They tend to peak out as we see here, 13 or 14 years of age, and then that slope kind of flattens. The boys will continue on to about 15 or 16. And beyond that point, the curve starts to kind of go down. And again, these are just high school kids. They're not athletes. So the message to the coaching staff is really, it's identifying the right qualities at the right time, because even as they're just continuing to develop, they will improve in a lot of this criteria. This is from the academy itself, from Aspetar Academy, from where Marco's from. So this looks at development. This is a cohort over a few years. This is male soccer players, which is another sport that I know well. In the top left here, we have counter movement jump, and this is over years. And again, you see that same pattern that they improve year over year. The slope, as you can probably see in the graph there, is 2.7 centimeters year over year. The bottom graph, the red line is the 25th percentile, and the blue is the 75th percentile. To the right of that, you have the 50-meter sprint. So again, speed improves. Van-Eval is a measure of endurance. And as you can see there, you can see that same rate of improvement, or roughly same rate of improvement. And the bottom right there is the lactate curve. So that just shows in a particular endurance athlete, they're basically lactate tolerant. So as their cardiovascular system and peripheral system improves, they can sustain higher intensities with less lactate accumulation. Okay. Rate of development and physical qualities. So up to this point, we see that youth athletes develop at different pace. Tracking their physical development helps in providing appropriate training prescriptions. And tracking performance is fundamental to athletics to avoid deselection. And I think this is where I could use this isn't a soccer player, this graph here, and this is definitely something, again, as I said, environment, a sport that I worked quite a bit. I was at Toronto FC for a number of years, and at my time at Toronto FC, we've dealt fairly closely with the French Football Federation and kind of use some of the metrics and advice that they were using. In France, to use an example, most of their academy systems are residential, so the athletes live there and they go to school there. They rarely will invite or offer someone a spot in the academy before about before the age of 15 to 16 years old. And this is part of the reason why, because as you can see here, these are two soccer players measured at roughly the same speed. And it has some data on maturation offset, which basically is a predictor of how far they are from their peak height velocity. But the graph represents their counter movement jump. So you can see that the one athlete there in the red, it was started at a higher point and developed quicker initially, whereas the athlete, the orange, developed very quickly over a short period of time and then sort of surpassed and kept climbing. So meaning that if you made that selection at 13 years old, that might lead to deselection down the line. And we really, the only way that we can really know this and how in this case, the clubs do this is they will bring them in every 2-3 months, 6 months. They will run some testing. They will see how they're performing from a technical perspective. And usually by about 14, 15, 16 years of age, they can make a pretty sound prediction who they think might be successful in their, in their first team. This is a study from this is the Italian database. So there's 5,000 entries. They're color coded for basically percentiles. So at the success at the senior level, which is elite, which is marked as the 97th to 100 percentile in their personal best. So these are our Olympic caliber high jumpers and long jumpers. There's 5,000 entries I may have mentioned. So they all enter. This was done over, I think, about 10-year span. And you can see that some of them sort of peaked out earlier on. Some of them kept climbing in those early years, and eventually went on into those into the red there. And this is about, the red is about 4% of this population in the study. And the main kind of takeaway from this particular study and graph is that success early on is not a predictor of success later as a senior athlete. So in this case, if you look at men's high jump, which is at the bottom there, and then there's the women high jump to the right of that, only 40% were of elite Italian high jump long jumpers were elite at the end of were elite at the age of 17. Only 25 at 16, only 16 at 15. Okay, and the data is very similar for women. A little higher, and that's actually something that I found interesting reading this article, is that for jumps in particular, the early predictor of success in women tends to be a little higher, and you can see there. So 59 women's high jump were elite at 17, and 59 were elite at 16. And of course, for the men, those numbers are quite different. Less so for the long jump, as you can see there on the right most. So only 36 at 17. And only about 25 at 16 and 22 at 15. So point is, athletes continue to develop beyond 17 and 18 years of age. This kind of speaks similar. So this is the Norwegian database. So that's on the top there, that's their top 200 runners. That's 800 meter and 60 meter on the left. And as well as jumps. And so here as well, you can see, and this is gender differences. This starts to look at gender differences here, that at up until about 13 years of age, boys and girls tend to progress at roughly the same rate. And beyond that point, that gap starts to widen. And this is again just from physiology and physical maturity. But here as well, a realistic expectation. So this is percentage of top athletes senior in top group by age. So This you can see on the bottom there. So this is shot put, hurdles, discus throw, 100 meters. To use hurdles as an example, only 12% of elite hurdles, senior hurdles, were elite at the age of 16. Only 26 at the age of 15, 23 at the age of 15, and so on and so forth. So again, just speaks to the fact that success at a young age that is not a good predictor to success at the older age, at the senior level. So the difference of why is there this difference? So at the top there, that's all running events combined, and to the right is all jumping events combined, and that's gender differences between men and women. And same thing you can see here, they kind of very close at up until about 13, and then it starts to take off quite noticeably there as far as the difference between the genders. And on the bottom graph, that's all running, jumping, and swimming events combined. And the purple line is testosterone. So that is pretty much the main difference maker. And you can see the two lines are almost identical. So in summary, effective coaching happens when training is appropriate to the level of the athlete. Assessing maturity status is key to inform training and put progress into context. Youth athletes performing well at a young age may not develop into senior performers. And this is probably one of the bigger points. Health and longevity in the sport should always come before performance at a young age. Training should be progressive, adequate, targeted to develop multi-skills and target all physiological systems. And biological development of youth athletes involve behavioral, psychological changes, which are key for sport retention and development. And I think the message of Marco's talk was that, youth athletes are very complex. If we think our, pro and elite athletes are complex, then youth athletes are even more complex, because there's many things that are changing on an ongoing basis, and it really does take a village, where coaching, sports medicine, psychology, all of it sort of comes together to help and lay a foundation to build that resilient athlete. And so from here, we're gonna go into some, just kind of break down some of those concepts a little bit more, okay? So we introduced peak height velocity through Marco's talk. So maturity categories based on maturity offset. And this gets a little technical. You can calculate these things, but I will keep it very simple as we go forward. But this is just some of the language just used in literature. So pre-height velocity, as we saw on the graph earlier in the presentation, is before peak height velocity. So about a year or more before peak height velocity. So this stage is characterized by early to mid puberty, typical characteristics, so rapid increase in limb length, less muscle mass, coordinations, and still developing, right? So these are sort of those early adolescent, approaching early adolescent. Then circa PHV or circa peak height velocity, sort of that immediate year and before and after peak height velocity. So this is where we see max growth velocity, temporary decrease in flexibility, and rapid anthropometric changes, meaning their long bones grow at a very rapid change, and everything that happens along with that from a sort of a biomechanical musculoskeletal perspective. Post peak height velocity is 1+ year after peak height velocity. So this is where the growth rate starts to slow, We have greater muscle development. We have improved coordination and strength potential. Some of the clinical implications for myself as a physiotherapist, so that pre-peak height velocity, we try to emphasize fundamental skills, mobility and technical training, high risk. So in this group, high risk of overuse injuries if training load is too high during these periods. Circa peak height velocity. So this is as we go through that immediate phase where you're at the top of that curve. We really monitor very closely for overuse injuries, which of course in track and field is a lion's share of what we see. Some of them listed here, things like Ausgleitschladers or severs, and there's quite notable coordination limitations as you know, as kids athletes work to adapt and adjust to their rapid periods of growth. Training volume adjustments to emphasize quality, injury prevention strategies, and these are all things that we'll talk a little bit more. And post-peak height velocity is where we start to develop a more structured program for them as far as strength and conditioning, and starting to implement some other strategies to essentially improve their load tolerance. And there's a lot of elements that go into that, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And so training loads based on maturity status. So as I mentioned, technical and foundational, you know, it obviously will vary a little bit if we're talking about soccer players versus we're talking about track and field, and even within track and field, is it sprinters, hurdlers, jumpers, throwers. So this will vary. And basic movement skills and aerobic base. Circa PHV, as I said, load management becomes critical, and injury prevention and technique maintenance is sort of the primary goal of that phase. And then strength, power, and performance as we emerge out of that peak height velocity. So some training load suggestions in the pre, so moderate volume, low moderate intensity, and emphasis on variety, low mechanical stress. So we don't usually do any heavy lifting at this stage. Focus on movement competency, and this usually even includes basic balance exercises. As we start to approach that peak height velocity, the suggestion is to reduce training loads, and the threshold for that is about 7 centimeters per year, which we'll talk a little bit more in the coming slide. Prioritize quality over quantity. So monitor growth rate, pain, include flexibility, mobility, neuromuscular control, and recovery strategies, avoid sudden spikes in load. This is where, and this could be you know, a talk unto itself, and this is where myself as a physiotherapist is pretty keenly involved, because we have some strategies that we monitor for to predict or try to prevent or catch early injuries that might become injuries unless you address them at the right time. And of course, we use some of this information to help us to identify the athletes that might be more at risk. As we move into the post-peak height velocity, this is where we start to introduce again formal strength training, plyometrics, higher volumes, but always training load monitoring and fatigue and recovery, okay, which is the next subject matter. So this is the relationship between peak height velocity in women. So you can see this is here on the height velocity. So up until about the age of 12, and that's sort of best available evidence we have, especially in North America, 12 to 13 is where peak height velocity tends to happen in girls, but there's some exceptions to that. Typically, menarche follows about 6 months to a year after. After menarche, the rate of growth slows quite considerably, and typically past this age, one can expect about 5 to 7 centimeters in growth. So it's a strong predictor of where they're at, when did they reach this, and you can see here it's listed at just above 8. So in the previous slide we said 7. So even measuring height, and I think this next slide speaks to that. Nope, not that one. Even measuring height will help to this one here. So tracking growth every 2-3 months, and this is something that we did do at Toronto FC because we had a big academy system. Will give you a good indicator, a very low cost indicator as far as when are they approaching that. So we know that the age groups, and even having something as simple as just height over, the more measurements, the more sensitive data we get. But even if it's done every 3 months or every 6 months, you'll get a good sense of when they started to approach that rapid grower 7+ centimeter a year, which is sort of, again, we consider a higher risk zone for injury. And we recommend adjusting training plans, and rather than stopping activity, it's more so limiting the impact. So repetitive drills like running, jumping, replace sessions with mobility, movement patterns, neuromuscular control drills. There's definitely some examples from other sports, because going through the specific movements, there's lots, but I will say if anyone's probably not familiar in the track and field world, there's something called the FIFA 11 Plus, which is a warm-up program that was developed for amateur soccer players. There is a good amount of relationship, especially in this age group, between a sport like soccer and track and field. So those tools can always be adapted. Even though they're developed for a different sport, those tools, and it's widely available, FIFA 11 Plus. Monitor pain, can use simple measures like a 0 to 10 scale. And we'll speak a little bit to this as well. And once again, this avoiding sudden load spikes, I think, is probably the big takeaway, as I'm sure many of you know. So load. So what is load? And this is more, now we're getting into more, how can we actually quantify? How can we actually capture what they're doing on a week-to-week, month-to-month, macro cycle level, right? So external load is defined as mechanical load placed on athlete during training stimulus. So that could be the total distance ran. That could be the number of sprints, high intensity running, which if we're thinking about things like hamstring injury, weight lifted, minutes trained. So all of these can be used potentially as a measure for external load. Interload is the physiological and psychological response to the imposed load. That could be heart rate, that could be rate of perceived exertion, which I'll show a graph after, or that could be blood lactate concentration. So heart rate and blood lactate concentration, there's nuances to it. The RPE is quite easy to use, and that's what we tend to go with, just because of its practicality. You can apply it with any age group. It's very low tech. So what is acute to chronic workload ratio? I'm not sure how many of our viewers today are familiar with this. It's been around a long time. Tim Gabbett, who is a sports scientist out of Australia, he's done a lot of the legwork on this probably in the last 10 years or so. So it's a methodology that allows us to capture a snapshot of their training or their match loads by calculating their acute workload, which is fatigue, by their chronic load, which is their fitness, i.e. what their body is used to, okay? So acute load performed by an athlete over 1 week. Common methods of calculating is by multiplying session rating of perceived exertion, so that's internal load, by the session of the duration. So as I said, minutes are sometimes easier to use, but it really depends on the population. If they're sprinters, it could be high intensity runs. If they're a jumper, it could be number of jumps. If it's a marathoner, it could be mileage or minutes. So this is really I think each individual kind of coach has to cater it to the population that they work with. And chronic load is typically measured over a 4-week average, but it could be any number. It could be 3 weeks, it could be 6 weeks, whatever that training cycle is, it could be adjusted. And this represents the indication of what the athlete has done leading up to the presenting training or match day. Some just quickly to go through this. So our ratio of 1.5, and I'll show the graph in a moment, found an increase of injury risk by about 2 to 4 in the subsequent 7 days. A ratio of less than 0.8 found a decrease in fitness level. So this could have been a planned break, this could have been a deload week, or maybe there was an injury. And 0.8 to 1.2 is is the optimal load, or otherwise known as the sweet spot, as far as this methodology is concerned. So this is, I just got this screenshotted from Google, just rate of perceived exertion, and as far as like what that would represent. So this could be easily shared, attached in an email, as far as what do the numbers actually look like. And I think this one here is a pretty good, characteristic. And they did look at these, and they do line up with heart rate data fairly closely. The trick is sometimes actually getting the true honest response, right? Because kids athletes will either overrate it or underrate it, and so that's where, and I think I mentioned in a slide, even getting this information, if you're doing it with with a group of them around, they'll probably all give you the same number. So it's finding a way to collect it where it's more again, shared Excel spreadsheet or app or anything like that, where you're more likely to get a true number of how did this feel to them. Okay, how did that session feel to them? Because that will vary. That will vary if they slept well, or they had a stressful day at school, or any number of factors, right? So that's where this captures some of that information. And this is just a screenshot from one of my triathletes. I just wanted to use an example of how this kind of information, what it at the end of the day tells us. So as I said, this is a snapshot of about 3 weeks. So you can see not too many days off. So, and that's always nice for me to know, just as far as what their typical training looks like. This here is the minutes, which is what we used in her case: run, swim, bike. These are the RPE, the intensities. This is just the training unit scores that the spreadsheet calculates. This is the weekly average here, the week total. And then the next 2 columns, the first one is the acute load. So that will give us more of like a week to week, how is it changing? And the one to the right there is more of a week to month. So that's the acute to chronic. What did they do this week, and how did it respond to, or how did it relate to what their body is used to in the previous 3, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever that parameter is. And it doesn't list it here, but I put a comment section in there, and this is where I encourage them to put anything in there. So you can see some of the ones. My left shin was really sore after the run for like 2 days. Felt good, get some left hip pain. And it could also be a muscle soreness score. It could be information with relate to sleep. We can add easily into that formula if we wanted to our peak height velocity calculation for height. So it gives us a lot of information in real time that we can use to make better predictions and better decisions. Okay? And this is an Excel spreadsheet, so not very difficult to institute. And this is the graph that's kind of at the heart of the acute to chronic workload ratio, and those are the numbers that I was talking about. So near the left here, so if they're coming off a break or a rest week or an injury, so their training loads or their acute to chronic workload ratio is going to be quite low. And as they increase week over week, that's what that number down here on the x-axis will tell us. This is that 0.8 to 1.2, that as we're getting this athlete back to sport, how can we measure and how we compare week over week and week over month the rate with which we're progressing, volume, intensity, and so forth. The red here on the right, so as I mentioned, as we get into 1.5 and above, that's our injury risk goes up. Not to say that they never get in here. There's competition, there's, in soccer, they call it match congestion. There might be 2 or 3 games or a tournament. So they will get here every now and then, but as long as we know about it and we can adjust for it and they're not in this range for a sustained period of time, then we can mitigate that injury risk. Okay. And so some of the final tips here and takeaways. So to obtain most precise acute to chronic workload ratio, the data used to quantify training loads needs to be reliable and accurate. The collection needs to be as reliable as possible. And the RPE is being used to quantify workload, consider collection. As I mentioned, so this is more that just not to get that washout effect that you're getting the same number from the entire team. And this is definitely the last point here is something that is, I've definitely run into, this is a challenge. It's a lot of information. If you have a squad of 10 or 20 or 30 athletes, or case may be, and as that Excel spreadsheet grows, it's a lot of information to manage. So, and that's where we, make some, adjustments based on the resources available to us, and relying obviously as much as possible on our support staff to help us with it. But it can be a lot of information if you don't have a sports science team around you, which probably most of us may or may not have. So in order to quantify both internal and external loads, using acute to chronic workload ratio, the user would have to input and manipulate potentially hundreds of data points, right? And this is scalable. This could be kept very basic, or you can add a bunch of different data points depending on, again, resources. And on the right side, it was just, build foundation and the pre-peak height velocity, injury prevention, training load, and adjust load. And the post-peak height velocity is more, progressive strength performance, performance training systematically. And I think that is it. So I know that's probably a lot of information. So hopefully, what do you think, Jill? Any thoughts? You're just muted right now. Jill, you're muted.
Am I muted?
You're good now.
Oh, so sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So I have a few questions and then I'll open it up. And I know there's a time crunch here. It's fair to say that athletes aged 13 to 16 really are at a very different physical and psychological maturity levels, and they are very unique. What do you think is the most important thing that coaches need to keep in mind from a long-term development perspective?
Well, I think it's just having all of these principles in mind that, as coaches, I think you interact with the athletes and you know them more from their characteristics, their, how they go about things, their, psychological readiness, are they, their, learning capabilities. And of course, we lean on the science a little bit as far as to identify, is this potentially, a early mature, or is this a late mature, or is this someone in between? And then right, like I think it's just quantifying things as much as you can quantify them. And then of course the training load, because if we don't have a way to capture it, it's a stab in the dark. Like it's really hard to make any predictions and adjustments. So I think it's using some of these strategies to track the physical and the biological, and draw what we can from the sports science to have some sort of systematic way to actually quantify it and make decisions and make adjustments.
Yeah, yeah. And then would you say the most important thing that parents should also understand?
Well, I think, you know what, I mean, this presentation took us what, probably a little over 30 minutes, but I think I have these conversations with parents all the time, all of it, pretty much all of it, because I think it's all important to understand. I think if we're talking about 11, 12, 13-year-olds, is just the whole concept of biological maturity and, peak height velocity and how that relates to injury risk, and being multi-athlete, in many cases that age group, they'll be doing multiple sports, and things that they might be showing up to the physiotherapy clinic for, and how that relates to what they're doing. And then at the end of the day, it's developing strategies, right? It's developing strategies. This is how we can quantify it. This is how we can measure, is this acceptable level of soreness, tightness, pain, based on what we're finding on our screening exams, and making adjustments. But I find in my experience, those adjustments really are made when the parent and hopefully the athlete are, they understand the subject matter to the best of their ability, so that you provide them with the information to make the best possible decision.
And just another one off the cuff, whenever you bring up multi-sport athletes, that's something that, with us in track and field, we and our young group, we have a lot of multi-sport athletes that might be, but not multi-sport as it used to be, where they play 3 or 4 things in a general way, but it might be a club swimmer, a club volleyball player on top of somebody that's also participating in track and field, and their loads from their other sports are quite high. So again, managing it and looking at them week to week with keeping in mind their other sports, like, is very important to make sure that they have easy days and hard days, and they don't just go hard on every day.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that's where I find keeping a spreadsheet, like something as simple as the acute training load, because it's not even for me as the therapist or as the clinician, they start to connect the dots a little bit, right? Because they're entering this data, they're looking at it, they're putting on their soreness score, and they're starting to make some decisions, and actually being more aware of this, which otherwise they would not be. But yes, I mean, going back to my days at TFC Academy, when they're coming in at 10, 11, 12, I mean, this is TFC Academy, so a lot of them were exclusively soccer players, even though we always recommend and do other things and don't specialize too early. But at that age, as again, they're kind of coming out of that fundamental, just get moving, get exposure, do different things, develop your athleticism, and they're going to 12, 13, 14, they're going through that, really critical development stage. we always encourage participation in multiple sports, right? But as they start to come up to 15, 16, and they're now in that like post-peak height, and we're starting to potentially start to see some more, again, the issues related to load, then we start having more conversations. Hey, where do you want to go with this? What is your priority? What do you want to emphasize? And if they want to continue to do multiple sports, that's fine, but you have to establish some sort of realistic plan. And again, it's always the foundation of that plan is having a system to actually quantify it and to evaluate how you respond, right? Because if it's coming back every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and their Achilles tendon or their quad is tight or their whatever they're presenting with, then we can say, you know what, this is a loading issue, and we can use some of the information from our clinical exam and from, depending on their age, from their maturation state exam, to again kind of work with the athlete and the parent to make some, and it's not necessarily that you have to stop and shut it down. You adjust your training, right? Maybe you go into the clinic or into the weight room, you work on the basic movements, you work on hip and knee control, you work on the injury prevention strategies, you work on cross training and aerobic base. You're just not doing the high impact things that they think they need to be doing, right? So I think sometimes even just phrasing and how you present it, will affect their perception of it.
Sounds good. We have one from the floor. What's your thoughts about training considerations with 300, 400, 800 meter training and events for those that are 13 years and older? So Nick, this would be athletes racing like 45, 50 seconds in the 300, 59, 70 seconds in the 400, 800s, like over 2 minutes, obviously. Considering like peak velocity and training the energy system, like any specific recommendations for that?
And sorry, and that's in what age group?
13 and older.
13. It's a really tough question to answer, just because going back to the presentation, based on the skeletal age, we have a group of 13-year-olds, but they're not all 13 years old. There might be a couple in there that are 10 and a half on their skeletal age, and there could be a couple in there that maybe 14, 15 that are much more mature and can tolerate higher training loads. So I think we always fall back to the data that we have and the systematic way to quantify their training and how they're responding to it, even if we knew nothing else, because you can never make a blanket statement on something like, because they will all be different, and we always have to treat them individually and have tools in place to measure that.
Okay. And again, we're kind of tight on time, but there's just a few more. What are some of the most common injury risks associated with rapid growth phase in developing athletes? Like, what do you see as most common injury risk?
Most often across all sports, we see a lot of Osgood-Schlatter's, which is Osgood-Schlatter's disease, more common in boys, but can occur, and that's more just traction apophysitis or traction injuries on the areas where as muscles, because what happens is the bones, they kind of grow quicker than muscles do, so muscles are always playing catch up. So, and that goes back to, in the presentation, the temporary reduction in flexibility. So what that means is you're going to have a lot more tractional force on the areas where these tendons attach, whether that's around the knee, around the hip, around the shoulder, if we're talking about more over like throwers. And so a lot of them are these overuse injuries with respect to tendon and bone. If we look at, of course, soccer players, basketball players, there's, injury like ACL injury risk is a consideration, which is not as much in track and field. And we don't tend to see as many, bone-related injuries until they get a little older. So a lot of it does tend to be these overused soft tissue muscle tendon injuries, which is kind of a good thing because they're manageable. If we catch them early, if we identify, if we institute an intervention, they're manageable.
Great. Okay, so I have another question. Is there any physiological evidence versus psychological factors to suggest that females will find it harder as they mature for retention in the sport?
My short answer, I'm not aware of any actual evidence based on the work, but it's a very broad topic. I can probably look into it, but I think we all know there's some very unique characteristics to female versus male development and participation in sport. So I would say that I can't speak of any particular literature that I'm aware of.
Okay. How does recovery need to change for athletes experience rapid growth?
Basically, the recovery has to increase.
Yeah.
And I think the number one single variable is just time between loading sessions, right? So, is it 1 day? Is it 2 days? Is it 3 days? We quantify what the loading session was, what the response was, and this physiologically we do know that biological tissue needs time to adapt and to recover, whether it's bone or tendon or muscle. So whether it's a 24-hour or 48-hour or 72-hour window, but this we're talking about the level of loading that they experience, that they're recovering from. Not to say that in those 24, 48-hour, 72 hours, they can be doing cross training, they can be doing their basic movement patterns, bridging, hip hinging, neuromuscular drills, that they can be in the pool swimming, that they can be doing other things, right? And especially, again, speaking to the population that we discussed today in that sort of 12 to 15 really critical time frame.
Sounds good. Last question that I have. What is your view of strength training for children before and after puberty?
Well, I think it's on a continuum. I think strength training is a continuum, and that's why I start to introduce basic movement patterns early. There is, again, the psychological learning capacity of each individual athlete. Sometimes at 8, 9, 10 years old, it's hard to expect for them that they're going to go home and they're going to do this on their own, right? So just a lot of supervision and just introducing it. And, as it goes through 12, 13, 14, depending on the individual, depending on, again, their psychological, how confident we are with their ability to execute what we're asking them to do, we would probably start to introduce some loading, right? It wouldn't be anything, it would be, again, max lifting or anything like that. But we would introduce some loading as they get to that late adolescent, 14, 15, 16, and so on. And then that, of course, is the prerequisite once they're clear into that pre-post peak height velocity, into that junior phase. That serves as a really nice foundation. Not only that it got them through that period and developed that, that capacity, right, to tolerate what they needed to tolerate, but then it serves as a really solid foundation for the next steps as they get into that more structured plan and more advanced, heavier lifting and plyometric drills and the rest of it.
Yeah, definitely. And I've seen you in the clinic. You're showing them all of the drills and stuff. But the nice thing is you can go down to Gold Ring, you'll go down to the second floor, and you'll actually go into the weight room and have free weights and show them exactly how they should be doing a few of those specific exercises, which I always thought, was great. So I think that that's it for tonight. I'd like to just thank the audience for your great questions. It was nice to hear, that you were participating with us. And thank you, Nikita, for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you, Kyle, for supporting us behind the scenes. And we hope that this has helped you support your athletes. Our webinar recording will be posted soon on Athletics Canada on their YouTube channel. And it was wonderful. So have a great night. Oh, I should actually mention, I didn't mention, I just noticed that Border City Track Club in Windsor is also hosting a youth coaching and mentorship summit on Saturday, October 18th. So that could also be something, if you're interested in youth sport and coaching, that you might want to as well check out. But anyways, everyone have a wonderful night, and thank you again for joining in.
Thank you, guys.